Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Territory Talk. I'm your co-host, Shaina Smith-Archer from the beautiful Virgin Islands, here with my co-host, Thomas Christopher Famous from the beautiful Bermuda Islands. I learned the other day that all of us are islands, actually. We used to think we were the only islands, Chris, and then you showed the map of TCI. And I realized, I was like, oh, it's interesting. So Cayman Islands, we know you guys are islands.
I think
Go ahead.
no, I'm saying only Montserrat and Anguilla doesn't have multiple islands.
Okay. We'll look into that. They just may have a small one someplace out there. But again, welcome to our OT and Caribbean family. Today we're gonna have another informational and informative topic. I do hope very interesting because I'm always curious to know what is happening in our beautiful environment in terms of what we had. We just want to say a quick shout out first off to our media partners, Cayman Marl Road Facebook page, Radio Turks and Caicos Islands, Montserrat ZJB Radio, the Virgin Islands CBN Radio FM 90.9, Bermuda's Channel 82, Radio Saba, PJFE FM 93.9, and Barbados' CBC Channel 8. We couldn't do this without you, and we are so grateful for you being a part of our media partnership. Today's topic, we're going to be speaking about all things environmental, climate change, and anything else our guests wish to enlighten us on as it relates to that. So I will, without any further ado, ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Miss Lisa.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on the program again. I'm really delighted to be here and delighted to be here with my co-guest, I suppose, Angela, who will introduce herself in a bit. But I'm Lisa Hurlston-McKenzie. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Resiliency in the Ministry of Sustainability and Climate Resiliency here in the Cayman Islands.
Great. And Miss Angela.
Hi, good day to the listening audience and to you, Lisa, and to the host. And again, thank you for having me back. I think the last time I was on it was with Lisa, actually, and it's always good to see Lisa. We're colleagues going back probably close to 15 years now. So just happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation. We are always, I think, happy for the opportunity to share on climate change, as it's something that affects us every day, but it's maybe not an everyday conversation. So it's good to be here to share. Thank you.
Great. All right. And again, thank you both for accepting our invitation. So we'll kick it off and get into, we were speaking before the show about the fact that you guys were at COP28. So I guess, Angela, I'll let you start off by first, reminding us what is COP? What does the 28 mean, if that's the 28th edition of it? And, share with us a little bit about your experience there.
Thank you, Shaina. So I guess in this field, we tend to bat around acronyms and assume that everybody knows what they mean. So I'll start by explaining what the acronym COP or COP means. So it stands for Conference of the Parties. And in this instance, it means Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is essentially the international law or international convention that deals with climate change. So how all of the nations of the world who have signed on to it or who are parties to the conference have decided that they will go about tackling the issue. And 28 just signifies, as you hinted to, the fact that this is the 28th conference of the parties who have signed on to the conference. There's a conference on an annual basis. So this is the 28th year that they would have met. Next year would be the 29th. So COP is, for anybody who has not been there, I think it's a bit hard to imagine. I remember Lisa and I went to COP, I think, for the first time back in 2009, if I'm not mistaken, together. And at that point, it was, I want to say COP 15. It was supposed to be the COP that would change the world. I remember in Copenhagen. And, a lot has happened since then. We're still not where we need to be. But essentially, the annual Conference of the Parties is the major event in the climate change calendar, but there's a lot that happens leading up to that event, where essentially the parties to the convention and the nations who have signed on are in constant dialogue about how they will meet the Paris Agreement, which is essentially an agreement under the convention by which parties have committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by a certain extent. And greenhouse gases are essentially the pollutant in the atmosphere that is driving global warming, driving the increase in average global temperatures that then have other trickling effects. So the nations of the world have gotten together and decided that they need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. The Paris Agreement indicates that each country has to indicate what they call nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. So this is sort of each country deciding, okay, the extent to which they will reduce their own emissions in order to meet globally agreed targets. Countries have also, or developed countries under the convention, are also committed to supporting developing countries, or least developed countries, small island countries, in the quest to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And that means contributing funds to do so, providing technical support. So the annual meeting of the parties of the COP is really a space where there are multiple negotiations and discussions being had around a number of important areas under the convention. But I think these days, the most important topics and the things that really marked the outcomes of COP28 are around climate finance. And we'll get into this, I'm sure, and Lisa will have a lot to contribute. But the big win for this COP was really the fact that they were finally able to operationalize I shouldn't say operationalize per se, but they were finally able to really fully establish the loss and damage fund, which we'll go into, which will have a significant impact on small islands like us here in the Caribbean. And they were also able to accomplish the first global stock take on climate change, and also agree on some targets around adaptation. So I think the focus of this COP was really some wins on climate change, but also really taking stock as to where we are globally and realizing that there's a lot of work to be done in a very short period of time if we're going to limit global warming to something that we can all live with, and that small islands in particular can survive. So I'll stop there for the moment, and we'll come back to some of those details, I'm sure.
Okay, great. And again, we understand. I think now, when I learned about COP, it was probably 2023 or something. So it kind of like it jumped into our consciousness because of the whole temperature conversation that started to come up in terms of we are literally warming up. So we've been hearing the phrase global warming, but the actual temperature changes now that started to take place more frequently in terms of what the data was saying was something I think that started to bring it into the forefront. But I guess for me, I don't know if this would be considered part of climate change, but when we had the hole in the ozone layer. And again, understanding the human impact, or the impact human activity has on our environment on that scale, where, we were concerned about essentially, again, all of this would create the warming that has started to happen. And then, so we were able to curtail the CFCs. There was those big bans, but, it's something else now that has taken its place. So Ms. Lisa, share with us, what was your experience at COP this year?
Well, actually, that's a really good segue from the Montreal Protocol that was established in order to address the ozone layer in the late 80s, early 90s, and often touted as one of the sort of wins for climate treaty and global governance of activities to reduce, as you rightly said, CFCs, which we have in most of our refrigerants cooling systems, in our AC, in our homes, in our businesses, in our vehicles, for example. And as Angela rightly pointed out, some of the wins from this particular COP, which has been a long time in coming, such as the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, which has been a discussion for small islands for some 30-odd years, and the transition committee that met last year for, I think, 4, if not 5 different meetings leading up to COP28 in Dubai in December can definitely be considered as a win for that entire global community that Angela spoke about under the COP, but I think also more broadly in terms of what we now understand and many people know these COPs or these international conferences to be. It's not just states and governments anymore. It brings in a breadth of stakeholders, the private sector most importantly, particularly to get things done like actioning a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions through technology, through transfer of funds, whether it's through the official UNFCCC mechanisms or other mechanisms that I guess we can talk about as well. So it's not dissimilar to the treatment of the ozone layer issue and the Montreal Protocol and every other amendment to that protocol that has come in the last 30, 40 odd years. So for me, I would say that has been tracking with my experience with COP versus the one that Angela mentioned that we were both at, Copenhagen in 2009, or Copenhagen as it was lovingly or maybe not so lovingly called back then, because it was the hope that we would get to Paris in 2015, which we eventually did, of course, with the Paris Agreement, but still not all the way there in terms of the language of the text, even for the Paris Agreement, which it recognizes the 2 degrees Celsius that we need to keep the global warming to, especially for small islands and low-lying states such as ours in the Caribbean and across other regions, particularly in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, but also having that aspirational goal of bringing it to 1.5, which is really where we need to be. I think there's agreement worldwide on that. So mostly you don't even hear about 2 degrees anymore. You always hear people referencing the 1.5 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So that you're right on the mark there, where these numbers have started to mean something, and they've started to mean something not just in our everyday talk amongst technocrats such as ourselves, but to the wider populace. And you heard and you saw and you felt that, I believe, at this COP. This was the largest COP ever, I believe, some 90,000 strong. Whereas when we were in Copenhagen, that was my first COP, so I was blown away by that, and that was some 30,000 people. And I thought that was huge then, running from one side of the Bella Center to the other. Whereas this COP, it was many different locations, even though the Expo Center, where the main meetings and side events and so forth were taking place in the blue zone and the green zone, there were other areas that events were taking place that we had panel discussions or interviews at. So it made for a challenge to all support each other and be together, but we did try our best, particularly when it came to meeting in the CARICOM Pavilion, which is, I think, where I bumped into Angela a few times, or at the UK Pavilion, where we had more official meetings and gatherings with UK ministers and representatives, as well as our own colleagues and ministers from our own territories. So I would say, just in terms of the whole workings of the COP, it's just gone in leaps and bounds. It's gotten bigger and bigger. It's been definitely more inclusive. It's not just government and state level action anymore. It's all of us in this boat together.
Okay. And that's great to hear you guys describe the evolution of it, because sometimes that helps to give indication of progress, as far as more persons are taking an interest in these conversations that are happening. Because again, sometimes there would be the big announcement of the event, and then maybe a press release, and then that's it. But that there's a lot more that's been happening. And even, I think it's 2 weeks now, or is it still just a full week?
It's a 2-week long meeting. Yes.
Yeah.
That's a very packed agenda, and there are multiple meetings happening. And there's, as I think Lisa hinted to, there's been a huge growth where this started as just a meeting of the conference of the parties, so governments, and it's now really ballooned into much more. So you have formal negotiations happening, you have a lot of one-on-one meetings happening, you have a number of what they call side events, which are formally organized by the presidency, and then events that are organized by different countries that are also attending the COP, not necessarily on the presidency's agenda. And that's really a great opportunity to get the latest everything climate change. I like to think of it as Climate Change University for 2 weeks. The latest on climate science, the latest on adaptation, on financing mechanisms, on energy reduction initiatives, not energy reduction, I meant to say energy efficiency and renewable initiatives. It's just an amazing place to go and network and connect. And hopefully at some point, Shaina, in the program, we'll talk about what's the relevance of small islands, especially the territories being present, because I certainly get that question a lot. I don't know if you get it, Lisa, about, why go to COP? The Virgin Islands only contributes a trickle. So I'm sure we'll come to that in the program. But
well, I guess that's a perfect segue to have that conversation, because one of the other questions that came to mind now, in terms of, again, we're talking about that temperature difference or an increase in temperature, and persons appreciating, what might sound like 1.5 degrees. And in terms of a small change, what type of impact does that really have on us in the Caribbean as a starting point? Because, there's so many other aspects to it, as you have alluded, in terms of why the climate is changing in the first place and the actions that need to be taken to prevent it. But let's start with what is it that we are trying to prevent? If the temperatures were to go up at 1.5 or more, what would be the impact on us?
Yeah. I don't know if, since I just spoke, Lisa, you want to tackle that for us, and then I can chime in.
Sure. Well, I'll just speak about Cayman in particular. I think we're not unique in that we face so many challenges here, particularly each hurricane season, but we're finding now too, not just in the traditional hurricane season, which seems to either start earlier or extend itself beyond where we would really like it to go. And then we have our winter storms, which in this particular year, just last week, we had a storm, a nor'wester, as we locally call them. And we haven't had one of these nor'westers for at least this strength for several years, maybe even some people might even say 2 decades. So we've seen those types of changes in patterns in storm duration and storm intensity, and whether they bring more rainfall or more wind. And some years in the most recent past, we have had tropical storms within hurricane season that have felt like hurricanes, and you can't convince some people, even if you show them the barometer and you show them other statistics, that it was just a tropical storm, that it was not a Category 1 hurricane, or that Hurricane Ivan in 2004 for us was just almost a Cat 5. It was a severe Cat 4, but not a Cat 5. You can't convince them of that. And at the end of the day, why does it matter? Why does it matter exactly what we say? I mean, to the meteorologists and the climatologists, yes, but to the average person on the street, the people that are feeling it, the people that are dealing with flooded homes, roofs that have either been compromised or blown off entirely. And we're only at 1.1, 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So hence why the 1.5 matters, and hence why rarely anybody, small islanders, or even those in larger industrialized countries, aren't really talking about 2 degrees anymore. Some are, because as Angela said, it's in their NDCs, it's in their nationally determined contributions, until such time as the global stock take might show that we need to definitely ramp up the ambition across the globe and get those NDCs and those commitments to where they need to be, to where we need to bring it to 1.5 well before the end of this century, well before where a lot of climatologists are saying we will be facing 1.5, on a more regular basis we can still bring that down within our most of our lifetimes. But, we really do need to make a concerted effort and send this message out from the small islands that we are facing serious issues now. And it's not just, this nebulous environment that we like to go and enjoy and, commune with nature. It is affecting our very livelihoods and our very existence, because of course most small islands, be it in the Caribbean or other parts of the world, obviously depend very, very heavily on tourism, depend very heavily on fisheries and other interests that take place along the coasts or in the marine environment, and even into the terrestrial environment as well, that may be affected by these frequent storms, these more intense storms, rainfalls, and or of course drought, which affects our agricultural sectors throughout these islands as well. So, I mean, there are plenty of examples, and I see that some are visually being shown on the screen now that we can speak to. We could have an entire day-long conversation just about the impacts to one sector, that just one storm or one event has had lasting impacts, not just, it's come, it's gone, and now it's over. Some of these things are very systemic, depending on where these impacts are actually taking place, in what communities, and what the adaptive capacity is for those communities or those local governments to really be able to be resilient, get back on the feet, bounce forward, so that if that becomes a typical type of event or the norm, as we call it, the climate change normalcy, then we'll be in a better situation to be able to adapt and address those concerns and those issues, which is why climate change is now more so talked about as a developmental issue with serious economic and financial consequences for countries. Hence why, as Angela mentioned before, this COP28, and they're even saying COP29 this year, end of this year in Azerbaijan, will be the finance COP. We hear that, I think, every year, don't we, Angela? But I think now that the Loss and Damage Fund, for example, has been established, and they will continue to have meetings to see how it will be operationalized. In other words, how the money will come in, how the money will go out, and who it will get to. And that is a very serious discussion for us, because as Angela knows well, and maybe some of the other people listening and following this discussion over the years, we as overseas territories have never been able to access these official funds. The adaptation funds, some of the special funds, the GEF, or the Global Environment Fund, for even necessarily non-climate type projects, and that has been a real issue for us. And one of the hot topics that we had discussions with leading up to COP and at COP with UK delegates there. And this was the first COP, I believe, that we were such a strong UK overseas territories across all of the regions, across all of the oceans delegation. Whereas back in 2009, when Angela and I were in Copenhagen, we did not have that type of presence. We weren't even under a UK delegation. We weren't there as part of UK overseas territories under that umbrella. It was through different stakeholders that we were very fortunate to be able to participate in that way. So those are just some of the takeaways there for how, again, things have progressed for us. That we're very happy about, but we still have a very long way to go because of the types of impacts that I just spoke about, and the fact that we're still locked out of the main mechanisms for financing from an international perspective. I will throw it back to Angela for her thoughts.
So quick question there while you're coming on, Angela, is in terms of, on the last point that Lisa made in terms of our being able to access the financing. To address, whether it's response to climate change impact or to put in measures that, help protect us. Is that because of our territorial status or something else?
It is, and I'll come to that very quickly. I just want to add a few more points on the side of impacts, because I think it's so important for people to appreciate what climate change means in a local context. I think one of the questions you asked or hinted to was understanding why, a small, what might seem like a small number, like 1.5 degrees difference in temperature, why does that matter? Why can that make such a big difference? And I like to give people the analogy of water versus ice. The difference between water and ice is 1 degree. There's a freezing point. And if you're not at that point, you have water. If you're at that point, you have ice. So if you could just extend that thought, temperature is really a fundamental control on the climate system. And when you tinker with temperature just a little bit, and when we talk about 1.5 degrees, that's a global average. So that doesn't mean that in every place you're looking at 1.5. In some places, it might be much more than that, right? So that's averaged globally. But when you have adjusted temperature by that amount at a global stage, you're affecting everything from ocean circulation patterns, rainfall patterns, and of course, ocean circulation then feeds into hurricane systems. So it's a fundamental control on the climate system. So we're not just talking about increases in temperature. And we would have all felt last year some hint as to what 1.5 degrees will feel like. If we think back to last summer and those very, very uncomfortable months of June, July, August, September, we're talking about that feeling of summer last year being the feeling all year round at best going forward. That's what, about 1.5 will look like. And while we're talking about 1.5, we have a very, very narrow window to act in which to keep global warming at 1.5. And if we don't act, we're looking at probably a 3 degree or more rise for the Caribbean region alone. So this 1.5 is by no means guaranteed. So we've already talked about the extreme events that will result, stronger hurricanes. The science is very clear about that. So we'll see more hurricanes looking like Irma, looking like Maria, looking like Dorian, being, the story of our future. Also, more frequent.
And while you're on those weather systems, one of the amazing things for me is what's happening out in California, where I forgot the word they use. How do they describe it? It's a strange name because initially it, for us, it sounds like it's rain, but then there are so much other things that are happening on the coast in terms of the storm surge.
Talking about the king tides that they're experiencing right now, the king tide that was a few days ago.
There was a king tide, but then there was a flooding that they had, and I forgot what they called it. It was something with the atmospheric something that was happening with them.
I'm not sure.
But all the rain that started to basically move in, and basically, it was just coming down in, like somebody turned on the fire hose, and there was nowhere for it to go.
Unprecedented events. You will see these sort of unprecedented events become more and more frequent climate change. And it's not just the extreme events. You have the slower, what they call slow onset changes. So sea level rise is a big deal for the Caribbean, as we talk about 1 degree change in temperature and ice melts. So you're having those ice sheets at the poles melting, causing global ocean levels to rise. And we're small islands with a lot of investment, infrastructure communities in those low-lying coastal areas. And we're talking about sea level rise of maybe a meter by the end of the century. And that means us losing significant landmass. In some countries that are very low-lying, you're talking about perhaps entire islands disappearing by the time we get to the end of the century, depending on the degree of rise that we experience, right? Yeah. And there's some systems or ecosystems that are critical to us in small islands like coral reef that are extremely temperature sensitive. So even with a rise of 1.5 degrees C, I've seen stats suggesting that we could have a further loss of up to 70 to 90% of our coral reefs. So coral reefs might become an extinct ecosystem, even with or near extinct ecosystem with a rise of 1.5 degrees C. And of course, that has implications for fisheries, implications for coastal defense. There are a lot of health issues that are wrapped up in climate change. Interesting ones like increases in childhood asthma rates. We also know that we'll have an increase in new diseases, vector-borne diseases like dengue and all of those mosquito-borne diseases that we are plagued within the Caribbean and many countries. So the implications of climate change are extremely far-reaching. And like I said, I think at the beginning of the show, climate change is really something that impacts every aspect of our life. So to turn quickly then to your question of funding, and maybe just to bridge it to say, you know, while we as small islands contribute almost nil in the global equation, or basically nothing in the global picture to this problem, not saying that we shouldn't do our part to mitigate climate change and reduce our own emissions. But the real reason it's so important for us to be a part of these conversations is that we are the very countries that are being affected the most, that are being affected soonest, and that have the most limited resources in order to try to respond to the problem that has been put on our doorstep. So it's extremely important that we're part of this conversation. And I like to point out the fact that it's really the small islands of the world who have championed the big wins that have come out at COPs over the years. 1.5 degrees is an invention of the Caribbean region. It's the Caribbean region partnered with small islands from the Pacific that made 1.5 degrees even get on the global agenda. Before that, they were talking about 2 degrees and higher rises, which would have been a death sentence to small islands. And now 1.5 degrees, while we only have a narrow window to act, it is now still the global goal. You know, it is small islands who champion the cause for a loss and damage fund and to really hold developed countries accountable and ensure that they support small islands and developing countries in the process that it would take to adapt, in other words, to build our defenses to these new impacts that we will be experiencing. So small islands are critical to the convention and the successes that we've seen over time. Now, the territories, we're sort of in a unique position in that while we are small islands, because of our status as territories as opposed to independent countries, it means that we are not parties to the convention. So we're not directly represented in that conversation that is happening. Our representation basically has to be via the United Kingdom or via the UK, which is a party to the convention, but of course is not a small island and it's not a developing country, it's a developed country. So that sort of puts us in the framework of the convention on the giving end of the equation when it comes to climate finance. So the United Kingdom is not a recipient of the Global Climate Fund, or the Green Climate Fund, yes, the Adaptation Fund or the JEF or any of these funding mechanisms. The UK is on the given side of the equation. And beyond that, the convention actually, because it's a convention of parties and because we're a territory, it doesn't actually recognize the territories in any special, in any way, I should say. So it's almost like, right. It's almost like we're invisible in the context of the convention, which puts us in a very, very tough place. So from my perspective, one of the big wins that we had at the level of territories, and I'm very happy to say this because it's taken us a long time to get there. From, Lisa said, back in 2009, when we didn't even go to COP under the banner of the UK, we went really under the banner of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, I think it was at the time. So to get from there to a point where we're now sponsored under the banner of the United Kingdom, because you have to be accredited to attend these conventions, and only parties and other entities like NGOs and so forth can be accredited. But we couldn't be accredited in the right of the Virgin Islands as a territory or Cayman as a territory, etc. So we've now for some years been attending under the banner of the UK, but this is the first time where we've been able to have really, I think, successful engagement with the UK delegation and coming out. And we went in with a very united front in terms of what were the priorities that we wanted out of that engagement. And I would say that the two big wins for the territories coming out of that, and these are all of the Caribbean OTs as well as OTs from other regions, is that the UK has agreed that they will make us a part of their negotiating process from the beginning right through to the time of COP. I think I mentioned earlier that COP is just a single event in the climate change calendar that runs throughout the year. So there are preparatory meetings that happen going up to COP, and the various countries are constantly preparing their negotiating strategy. So the UK has agreed that we would be engaged at some level in the preparation of its negotiating strategy, so that we have some avenue by which our voices and our concerns can be put on the table and addressed in the space of the convention. And I think the second important win is that because we are not yet able to access the funding mechanisms through the convention, we've put to the UK that it would be appropriate for the UK to establish a dedicated fund to provide that support to its territories. And at least we've started the conversation, and I can say that we had those meetings at the ministerial level, and the minister responsible for net zero has been receptive to that request, and we'll now have to go through the formal process of writing, making the request, taking it forward. But we did have a very successful initial meeting with that request being, I think, heard and understood, and like I said, received well. So we're optimistic that it will hopefully one day result in some sort of a dedicated climate fund where the territories can receive direct support on an ongoing, long-term, sustained basis from the UK to address our climate change issues that go beyond just environmental impacts, but infrastructure, resilience, and much, much more.
And I think I remember hearing our premier here in the Virgin Islands speak about that when they did the press conference after their return as one of those quick wins, because I don't think we appreciate sometimes the struggle that we have as, small island states, one, and then also as territories, meaning we don't have sovereignty like Jamaica, Barbados, that when they enter the room, they can speak for themselves and represent for themselves in terms of advocating for certain things. And, for us, it was Hurricanes Irma and Maria. For the Cayman, it was Hurricane Ivan. The level of devastation, not just the devastation, I should say, but the level of recovery in terms of, did our governments have the funding or the financial resources to basically build back the country, to restore things, especially the services side of things in the first instance. And even now, I don't know, persons again appreciate that when we talk about coastal roads, because we were just talking about the islands, islands possibly disappearing. And I asked Chris to see if he finds a picture of the president of Tuvalu when he made his presentation standing up in the sea, just to illustrate that, hey, we're literally losing our country to climate change, as a result. And, that for me was when I really sat forward in the chair and say, all right, this is real. So what we're seeing, we have to start to connect things together, and the importance of having the access to these funds to be able to, go on. So the poster now up is saying home to 40,000 gone by 2050. Imagine, that's something as a world, that's definitely a complete change in the world that we know as is, to imagine that something like that can actually happen.
Yeah, and this is real. I mean, right here, that picture reminds me of Anegada, and that's something for us to think about as Virgin Islanders. Will there be an Anegada by the end of the century? And islands like Cayman, I think that concern stretches across their entire, territory, as opposed to maybe just one island. So it's a very real issue. I think we don't have it in the forefront of our minds enough, and it's something that should permeate all of our thinking and decision making, including when we think about development and where it's strategic to think about making investments, and how we think about developing our beaches to make sure that we can have beaches 100 years from now by allowing them room to migrate, for example, as the sea level is rising. So we need to be thinking about climate change in all of our decision making, from our tourism sectors to infrastructure decisions to our health sector, fisheries, agriculture, the whole gamut, because all of those things will be affected.
Yeah. The coastal roads is probably one of the first things that comes to mind in terms of when we're doing, let's say, road infrastructure projects, that we're not just thinking about maintaining what we have, but that we have to think about, hey, do I need to raise these roads? Because at some point they may very well disappear, or we understand the encroachment because the seawalls as they stand right now are essentially too low, because as the sea rises, your roads are literally going to be in the sea. Lisa, what are some of the effects, if any, that you are experiencing apart from the hurricanes? Because I think Chris showed a picture of beach erosion, and I know that has been a challenge for you guys, or for all of us rather, especially after the storms, where I can see, some of my favorite beaches, the beach profile completely changed after Irma, and it has never recovered since.
Yeah, certainly. Definitely 7 Mile Beach, the world famous 7 Mile Beach, as some of you may know, and hopefully been able to enjoy it before it got to the stage of some of the pictures that have been shown. And it's not just the storms that we have, it's the storms that we don't get. As I was saying before, we have enough scientific information for the last 25 odd years that we have a better understanding of that particular system and its small pocket beaches that actually make up the extent of that 5.5 to 7 mile stretch of beach, and understanding how the sand is transported on what used to be on a fairly regular basis or on an annual basis, brought by our nor'westers, the storms that we would get this time of year, January, February. And we weren't getting that for several years. So the beach wasn't being replenished in the way that, we
normal cycle happen
on the regular basis. Exactly. And coupled with obviously sea level rise, which, as Angela says, is a slow onset impact of or effect of climate change that you can't necessarily really see and or measure unless you're being very, very deliberate about it using several different tools. But coupled with also poor development practices, building in the active coastal zone, building the very seawalls that we were just talking about, some very much out of necessity in order to protect property and people, but others not so much so. And now, it's the hard decisions of policymakers and planning boards and others to really determine what is in the best interest of those systems that obviously function, particularly 7 Mile Beach, that obviously function as a major tourism asset for the country. So it's how to balance the very, very difficult question of how to balance all the interests, the tourism interests, the recreational interests and value that those beaches and systems used to bring in the past, and hopefully will continue to bring future generations if something can be done to have a just solution to some of these very, very difficult questions. Climate change aside, but that always has to be thought of in that sense, because anything that we do today can obviously have implications down the road if we make a poor decision, what we typically tend to call maladaptation. And obviously we've had enough of that, and we don't want to continue to perpetuate those types of situations happening. It's critical that we understand what these decisions mean from a loss and damage perspective as well, because as you rightly said, Ivan was really our wake-up call. That was a $3.4 billion event for us that, yes, we got our tourism industry up and running for the better part quite quickly, I think, relative to perhaps some of our other neighbors that had that same experience in that year or a similar experience in other seasons. But the long-term effects we probably didn't realize until many, many years afterwards, particularly in the housing sector. I think most people tend to focus on what they can immediately see: tourism and agriculture, which are our most climate sensitive economic sectors. But, you know, how we all, I believe it's fair to say, tend to live in the Caribbean, very close-knit communities, extended families, not having difficulties and necessarily going to stay for a temporary, even a long-term time frame with a family, you know, an extended member of family, if you are displaced from your home whilst it's being, or even your business, whilst they're being, done up after a hurricane or after an event, even if it's just a flooding event from very heavy rainfall inland, nothing to do necessarily with coastal erosion and coastal flooding. But then you tend to, as the years go on, forget that some of those people are still with their in-laws and they're still technically displaced. They may not be like the Marshall Islands or some of the other islands in the Pacific that are actually looking at signing migration agreements with larger countries like Australia or New Zealand, or maybe some of their closer neighbors in their island chains, but they're still displaced in their own country. And it may only just be a few miles down the road or a few miles inland. And some of those effects we can definitely see. Those of us that live in Grand Cayman and even in our sister islands, that we know houses that have just not been occupied. They've just not been fixed back up, or at least to the extent that they used to be. And know that whole sense of place and sense of community is affected, gets disrupted, and it percolates down into people helping people. If those people are no longer there to help, you know, those that are still there in successive occurrences that happen, then it has that knock-on effect, and that can tend to be generational.
Yeah. And that's one of the things too, where, you know, as usual, we never have enough time for this, but the social implications of climate change, because when you have these, you know, catastrophic events, you know, short of loss of life, your quality of life has been shifted. And for some people, again, depending on the resources they may or may not have, you know, what type of social assistance may be in place. Because, you know, again, we're nodding our heads because we completely understand that, you know, after hurricanes Irma and Maria, we had the same type of disruptions in our community, and it's still visible in terms of, again, rebuild of homes. I remember, you know, from where I was working in the Ministry of Health, you know, there was the question of assistance with rebuilding of homes, but then there were questions around home ownership, because in some cases it was still in family estate. So, you know, there are so many things that can knock on, as you're saying, you know, that trickle down as a result of what may appear to have been one event. But then that event has the economic implications, it has a social implications. And these are things now that our governments have to plan for, as well as the individual. Because I know for us here that persons went through the hurricanes, and, you know, in the process of recovery, we were hit with the pandemic. So that was a different type of storm that, again, had some very dramatic effects that, you know, persons are still feeling the pain from, so to speak. And that's where, you know, the important work that you guys have been doing in terms of lobbying for access to the financing, to be able for us to be able to, one, you know, do the prevention in terms of mitigating against risk, because, you know, we can't control hurricanes, but it is something that the response that we bring to, you know, when the events happen helps the community know to recover even better. So we're going to take the last few minutes that we have, though, ladies, and I want you guys to explain to us, in terms of, apart from the money, what is the change in behavior that's needed to mitigate against the 1.5 increase in temperature? Because I know persons, again, may hear a lot of this in the news in terms of, you know, what may be happening or not happening in the Amazon, trying to move from fossil fuel to renewable energy, you know, and what needs to happen there also will require funding. And Angela, I found the word. It was atmospheric river. That was my new word last year. That was what they were calling the storms in California, saying that there was an atmospheric river,
Probably
like
very apt.
river
Yes.
pouring out of the sky. Yes, so that was my new weather terminology last year. But
Yeah,
so what
quite.
are some of the things, again, whether it's at COP or even locally, what are those change of behaviors that we are looking at in terms of, again, we were saying that, the developed nations are the ones that are having or triggering their behaviors are having more of an effect on what's happening with our climate because of, whether it's fossil fuel or other types of pollution, basically, whether it's in the marine environment or the air, as far as I'm concerned. All of these things are adding up, so to speak, and piling up on us. So we understand, when we see some of these conversations that may be happening in the news, again, leading up to COP, we appreciate, why certain things are a good thing in terms of policy decision and other things may not be to our benefit. Angela, you want to jump in?
Sure. I think we just had a bit of a skip, at least on my side. But essentially, we use these two terms in the climate change world, mitigation and adaptation. And I think you're asking about mitigation, which is what can people do to really help to limit the extent to which we have climate change in the first place by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I will definitely respond to that. And I also want to pitch in a bit on the adaptation side, because again, that's so critical for us being on the front lines of climate change. So on the mitigation side of things, really, I think for us in the islands comes down to how we use energy. And I think we're blessed to come from a region where we have ample alternatives around us. Solar, wind in some countries, geothermal in some countries, hydropower. And climate change aside, just from a strictly economic perspective, I think it's high time that we really transition and focus on harnessing these resources. I forget the percentages offhand right now, but so much of our economic output is bled out of our countries through fossil fuel imports. And if we took those costs and reinvested them in our countries, we could be a lot further along in terms of other gains that we want to make, whether it be in the areas of infrastructure or health, etc. I had the stats somewhere, but I think it's something like equivalent to maybe all of the money that we spend on capital projects is equivalent to what we spend on fossil fuel imports. So you can imagine instantly being able to double our infrastructure investment budget if we were to really focus on alternative energies. So that has to be, I think, at the whole territory scale, but it's also at the scale of every individual, every business to start making those conversions. And I'm very optimistic that we'll be soon getting our Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund up and running, which will be one avenue through which it can be more affordable for people to make those kinds of changes. But it's not just about renewable energy. Energy efficiency has a major role to play just by using more efficient appliances. And by that, I mean the type of fridge you use, the type of television you use, all of everything that plugs in to a wall, an outlet. These days, there's likely a more efficient option on the market. So it's about, a light bulb. It's about making those smart consumer choices. Even electric vehicles, moving in the direction of that. And that comes with a lot of infrastructure to support it. But there are incentives out there now that I would encourage people to take advantage of in terms of duty-free or reduced duties on those types of energy efficiency investments and electric vehicles. So I would encourage people in that vein on the mitigation side. But again, for us as small islands, on the adaptation side, it has to happen at every level. Again, it's not just the job of government. It's the job of everybody to adapt, and for individuals, I think critically that means thinking about where we invest, not just how we build being very important, but also where we build, and not building in areas that we know are going to flood. So not building, next to, as we call them here, a gut, not building right on the shoreline, not filling in the salt pond, and building in the pond and then, wondering why the place is flooding. So we have to be smarter, and especially now that we're in an environment of climate change, of building in appropriate places that are not inherently hazard prone, but also about protecting the very systems that will serve as our defenses to climate change. So protecting our mangroves, they're extremely significant when it comes to coastal defense. Mangroves, I think it's something like 100-meter stand. They can cut down wave height by over like 60% or some crazy figure. So mangroves, coral reefs are natural, they're free, and they're extremely effective, more effective than any seawall that you can build at protecting our coastline. So we have to get smarter about protecting our natural environment, because it will be one of our key defenses to climate change. So I'll stop there so Lisa can have a chance to chime in. Thanks.
I would just concur with everything that Angela said, particularly about the ecosystem-based adaptation that she spoke about with our coastal systems, seagrasses, coral reefs, mangroves. I think we have a tendency, particularly in islands where we were once 70% wetlands, and they were seen as nuisance areas that did nothing but just breed mosquitoes and put a huge damper on our tourism aspirations in growing that sector. Well, we have moved well beyond there. It's been 40, 50 odd years, if not longer, that all of us, I believe, have really had successes from different types of tourism. Obviously, most of us leaned towards mass tourism, mass cruise tourism, and we have now benefited from that, inclusive of the infrastructure along the coast that is now, at risk in many parts of our islands from successive storms and more intense storms. I think it is high time that we stop demonizing or taking for granted the systems that serve us well. And we unfortunately only realize that once catastrophe has hit. I think in terms of behavioral changes, the technocrats amongst us still have a little bit of work to do in properly assessing the value of those, not just the economic value for them that can be brought on a market, for example, with carbon credits and so forth. But if we even do, to ensure that those types of mechanisms for gaining funds for us are, as Angela said, properly applied where they need to be. That means in national budgets that we need to identify where we need these adaptations to take place and when, prioritize those so that when the larger, hopefully, international finance comes to us, either through this dedicated United Kingdom fund or other funds that we have as the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. I'll put a plug out there for Raquel and Keisha and all the wonderful ladies and men there, tend to say is that we have shovel-ready projects. Because I believe many of us know what we would love to do if we had the money, but we don't necessarily have all of the financials of those projects and the economic and or social benefits that you spoke about, and even the cultural side of those proposals necessarily really honed in on. And I think it's critical for us to do that. We can't just beg, borrow, and steal the money. We have to show how the money, when we actually are able to access it and are able to get it into our bank accounts, will actually be used and will be applied, and where we will see not just value for money, but where it will have a lasting impact on the lives of people on a day-to-day basis, on their livelihoods, sustaining them and building that continual resiliency into our economies and into our communities. So as Angela says, it's not just a top-down governmental exercise, it's a bottom-up. We are all in this together because I think we have all seen from catastrophic events like an Ivan, an Irma, a Maria, that it is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter whether you are a high income in your country or struggling maybe a little bit and on the reliance of social protection programs. At some point in time, we are all standing in long lines trying to get access to water or money out of bank machines that don't have any electricity. So we're in the line for the banks and the good old tellers are there, and where we need person-to-person contact and support of our friends, families, neighbors, as well as our representatives at the local and national level.
Yeah. Well, ladies, I think we have done an excellent job today continuing to ring the bell about this very important issue that, is facing us, locally, regionally, internationally, that we all have to continue to, as we're saying now, not just be observers, but actively, ready to go, to be a part of the solutions that are needed and not waiting for someone to do it for us, because this is going to impact us directly even more, because we're already feeling it. So now that we know and have even more information on that, I think I thank you for coming, and I think we broke it down completely to the point where we understand those hot summers. I would love to be on the beach all year long, Angela, but not in that heat. Not in that heat. All right, so we are going to stick a pin here because, again, as we said, we have to consistently, keep having this conversation to raise the awareness of our communities and educate ourselves about how we, again, can be a part of what is happening and needs to happen. And I will turn it over to Chris to wrap us up and thank our media partners.
Yes, thank you, ladies, for letting me sit in the background of this important show. It's always great to let the professionals just do what they have to do. I want to thank Miss Angela Burnett-Penn. We didn't get a chance to talk about the Irma diaries this time, but we'll talk about it next time, because you have helped to chronicle not what can go wrong, but what is going wrong with all of our ecosystems. And I want to thank Miss Lisa Hurlston-McKenzie, because she is a champion, a quiet champion for Caymanians, and not just Caymanians, but the region. And we have Miss a lady in we were in Bahamas. We were all in Bahamas about 2 years ago, I want to say, and we had Miss what's her name? She's from Anguilla, but she was doing a lot of work. And we had Ms. Williams from Turks and Caicos. So I say that in the sense that although we are small in size, when we work together as overseas territories, we are able to share a lot of ideas and get a lot of things done. So from left to right, we have Ms. Williams, Ms. Lisa Hurlston-McKenzie, Lady in Blue from Virgin Islands, Miss God, her name. It'll come back to me. But Carinthia, Rose.
Yes.
And from Anguilla, and then on the far right, we have Minister from Turks and Caicos. But I put this up to show that this is a thing called Women in Leadership, that a series that we do. And I want to wrap up to say thank you to these women of the overseas territories that are leading us, the ignorant man, the ignorant politicians, into doing better, because we're not going to get a second chance. I know that we don't control the global environment as far as the heat, but as far as mitigation, raising up the roots, as Shaina said, and other things. The example in Virgin Islands, we have to do better with our incinerator, right? All of that fumes going out to the west coast, the west side, that's not good. In Cayman Islands, the overdevelopment, especially in your mangrove areas, that's not good. In Bermuda, every we can't control the global environment, but we can control our own environments and change things. So I just want to thank you all on behalf of everyone in the overseas territories for all that you do, and I look forward to continuing this series sometime in the near future. And of course, thank you to our media partners, Cayman Montserrat, Miss Sandy Hill, Radio TCI, Montserrat ZJB, Virgin Islands, the Cox Brothers in Bermuda, Lemon Woods, and Saba. And we also have our major media partner in Barbados. We want to thank you all. Until next time. All right, Shaina. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay, let's try this again. Until next time, we want to thank everyone for tuning in, whether it's online or through the radio stations or even our viewers on TV. So until next time, we will see you as we continue to unite and educate our OT and Caribbean family. Have a good one.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.